Hi, I'm Jim Hall, host of Cult Pop, and we've got a great show today. We're in Ann Arbor, and today we're at the Carytown Book Festival, a celebration of Michigan authors, and we're just having an absolute wonderful time. We've got three great authors from Michigan here today, and we're going to start with Markus Sakey. He's a fabulous author of the thriller The Blade Itself, great book. Then we visit the wonderful novelist Elizabeth Kostova, author of The Historian, an absolutely fantastic novel that you're really going to want to track down. Finally, we're going to talk with Loren D. Estleman, a famous Detroit author, written over 50 novels. Fantastic, fantastic guy. So we want you to stay tuned for Cult Pop. I'm with Markus Sakey, the author of The Blade Itself, a wonderful thriller that's come out, and it's kind of a story of an everyday man whose past comes back to haunt him. Markus, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
I absolutely love The Blade Itself. It was a fantastic thriller, getting wonderful reviews, compared to all kinds of great authors in the same genre. And I really liked Danny Carter, main character. You really get a feel for him. He's an everyman. He's somebody that most people can really identify with. And he's got the same issues everybody else does. He's working in construction. He's kind of getting his life going, has a sweetheart that he's really starting to get attached to, thinking about a real potential for a future, but then the past comes in and really kicks him in the behind. Tell us a little bit about the story from that point, and then we'll get into a little bit about your life and how you got into writing.
Sure. The book is the story of two friends who grew up on the south side of Chicago. They're small-time thieves, blue-collar kids, just sort of making a go of it, not really thinking about tomorrow, until a robbery of a pawn shop goes desperately wrong, and one of them goes off to Stateville Maximum Security. The other, Danny Carter, the hero, rebuilds his life, and he spends the next 7 years making a legitimate citizen's life for himself. So he says he's got a girlfriend, he's got a real job, he's made something that he can cherish, until his old partner comes out of prison and feels there's a debt to be settled.
And in the book, as that gets going, when Evan comes out of prison, there's a little bit of guilt issues. Danny's kind of, at first he hears a little apprehensive, but first he thinks, well, this was my best friend. But then, as we start to read the book, we already know the changes that have come about in Evan, in some of his actions immediately following his release from prison. And then Danny's not quite aware, but he pretty quickly gets the feel that Evan's not the kid that I grew up with. It's not the young guy that we were just having fun and doing this until things went bad. Evan's now on the other side, which the prison system will do a lot. Tell us about how Danny then has to get into dealing with a situation that really starts to get pressure-packed.
Sure. What I wanted to do was I wanted to make Evan a real character as much as I could. I wanted, from Danny's point of view, at least I wanted you to think about this guy as his old best friend, a guy he could always count on. A guy with a temper and maybe who went too far sometimes, but he was generally a good guy. But 7 years in maximum security will warp anyone. And that was one of the themes that I really wanted to look at in the book, was just that no matter who you were, if you spend 7 years in a world where survival is based on the rules of prison, you're going to come out an entirely different person, and you're not really fit for society when you come out.
Well, I was really impressed with the book, and I think it rings true to a lot of people, because no matter who you are, when you start to change, you start to grow. Some friends get left behind, some people get left behind because of education, because of the people you hang with, because of who you may choose to marry, your job you may have.
Sure, the small
and these
choices
issues all
in
come
life.
up, but on a much... So all of us have had similar circumstances, but not quite as desperate. But I think almost any guy or lady can put themselves in Danny's situation. You feel a loyalty to somebody that was very tight with you for all these years, and then all of a sudden, that person is not the person who's tight with you. What do you do then? But
I appreciate that. I'm glad to hear that you felt that way, because I was trying to tap into the idea that he's not that different. Danny isn't that different from you or I. His friendship with Evan wasn't that different from you or I. They were just 2 degrees off, and then 7 years of prison put him 20 degrees off.
Now, Markus, I'm always a little leery when I do an interview. I know you don't want to give away too much of the book. You obviously want to sell the book. But things really ratchet up. There's a scheme that Danny's brought into that normally any sane person wouldn't do it, but he has to end up doing it because the things most important to him are threatened. His livelihood, his life, and his family.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the bad situation he's put into.
Well, one of the ways I describe the book is the more you have to lose. And that's sort of the idea, is that because he's built this new life for himself, because he has something to cherish, he's also got something that makes him vulnerable. And the more you love things, the more weaknesses you have. So what Evan does when he comes out of prison is he sort of systematically ratchets up the pressure on Danny's life. And Danny gets caught up in something that maybe he wouldn't do if he could step back and think about it rationally, but there's so much on the table that he has to, and then it just keeps getting worse. My basic rule for thrillers is the first chapter sets it up, and after that, everything falls apart.
Well, I really like the way you say he ratchets it up a little bit. At one point, he shows up in his house unexpectedly, but how bad is that really? You think, okay, he's my buddy, blah, 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 and then it gets a little worse, and then it gets a little worse until it's just everything is snowballed out of control. And that's what I really liked. An aspect of the book I love so much is that it really is, you hear the old cliche, it's a page turner. Well, it really is. He's going, okay, well, what's happening now? What's this jerk doing? What's this SOB really trying to push? And that's what that Evan was really, you can't stereotype him as the stereotypical thug, because really, he was 2 or 3 steps ahead of his buddy who's now made the life for himself.
Yeah, that's the other thing, is that Danny is now a civilian. Mm-hmm. He was once in the game, but now he's just a regular guy. He's you or I, and he responds about as well as you or I would if we were faced with someone who's still in the game and is a tough, ruthless criminal. We'd be caked to guys like that, and Danny is. He still thinks that he has props in that world, but he doesn't. He's just a civilian now, and that, again, that whole idea of the things that you love making you vulnerable.
Now, in going over the internet stuff to kind of learn a little bit more about some other reviews and such of your work, you were very favorably compared to Quentin Tarantino, and Quentin's use of the language and stuff is always something that's always talked up. What I really liked about your stuff is the authenticity, whereas Quentin Tarantino's stuff sometimes goes over the edge. And when I read a little farther, I read that you actually shadowed homicide detectives, spent some time in a morgue to see some of that going on. Tell us a little bit about that and some of the real life experiences you had to write this now.
Researching the gritty details is the best part of writing crime fiction, because you get to see these parts of life that nobody else sees. So I shadowed homicide detectives. I've been to crime scenes. I've watched them go through a lot of the investigative process. I toured the morgue and learned how an autopsy was performed. And one of my favorite things about it, I learned how to pick a lock, which is something
right.
Danny can do. It's startlingly easy. I Googled how to pick a lock, and about 1.5 million pages came up. I ordered a set of lock picks, and it's just bent wire. There's nothing fancy in them. After 2 hours of practice, I could pick the lock on my front door. And it was just, to me, that illustrated the whole thing, the illusion of safety. Is you lock the deadbolt, you feel like you're safe, but anybody who wants to get in can get in.
And shadowing the homicide detectives, was that kind of a scary experience, or was that invigorating?
It was a pretty amazing experience, because it's a side of life that that is completely outside your experience. So I went to a crime scene one time where it had been a shooting. The guy had been taken off in the ambulance, and the detective is standing there, and on this side there's a pool of blood, and on that side there's a pool of vomit. And he's got his arms folded, and he just pauses as we walk up, and he says, "I think we solved the world's problems over bow tie pasta with garlic." I mean, you can't write that stuff. You can't make that up.
Now, those type of little events, though, I can see in your writing, and I'm so thrilled for you that this the Blade itself is getting such favorable reviews. But when you take the time to make your writing true and real like that,
thank you.
I think that really came across in your work.
Thanks.
Now you've got a great website. We haven't touched on that yet. MarkusSakey.com, mm-hmm. And at that, if you're watching this and you just kind of get a feel for the Blade itself, and Markus is a great guy, but you're thinking, well, let me see, let me read something. First chapter of The Blade itself is on there, and
the first chapter of my new book, which is called At the City's Edge. It's another standalone crime thriller set in Chicago. It's about a former soldier who comes back from Iraq to find a similar war in his South Side Chicago neighborhood. And it's got politics and corruption and gang warfare and a love story and sex and a car chase and Roman history. All kinds of good stuff.
That opening, my producer really likes that. He gives it 2 thumbs up over there. Says that sounds like a great story. But the chapter you have up, that really sells the book. I said, well, man, I was like, when's the date coming out? I really want to read this. So
Thanks,
you're doing
Jim.
a good job of really pre-selling that book, because that looks fantastic.
Thanks very much.
We've got a couple minutes left. I wanted to touch on the fact that, for people at home, that sometimes people are really into this. you're originally from Michigan.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
family still lives here.
I was born in
stuff?
Flint, spent all my life in Michigan until I graduated from college. I went to school here at U of M.
Do you foresee writing any novels in the future that take place in Michigan at all?
Honestly, I'm kind of doing it one book at a time. It's a funny thing because you write one book and all of a sudden you're supposed to know how to do it. Yeah. So I finished my second. There aren't many careers where after doing it once you're supposed to do it again as if you know what you're doing.
And make it better than the first time
Yeah,
around.
and so they prefer the pilot who lands the plane has done that more than once.
You're right.
Before they. So I really don't know. I love Michigan. This will always be my home. So it's definitely possible.
Well, an absolutely fantastic debut novel. Folks at home, I can't recommend enough. The Blade itself, really a great thriller.
Thanks, man.
Just so much. It was so much fun. I interview a lot of people, and I'm lucky in the fact that I interview people whose books I enjoy. So a lot of times in these interviews, you get a lot of, hey, I love this. This was great. This was fantastic. Well, I really mean that because I'm interviewing people whose stuff I really enjoy.
Thanks,
so I
Jim.
want to wish you continued success. I look forward to seeing you when the next novel comes out, and we'll do it all again. But
Sounds great.
You've written a fantastic novel, and
Thanks,
I can't recommend folks at home pick up The Blade itself, visit his website that you've seen throughout the show, and I think you're absolutely going to find one of your new favorite authors in Markus Sakey. So stay tuned for more Cult Pop. Okay, we're still here at the Carytown Book Festival, and we're having a wonderful time, and we've just run into a wonderful, wonderful author, and we're just so pleased to have her, Elizabeth Kostova, the author of The Historian, just an absolutely wonderful novel, and it's a part history novel, part Dracula novel, tour de force, just absolutely wonderful reviews, and Elizabeth, yours is one of the most interesting stories to publishing that I've ever heard. So first of all, thank you so much for being with us today. And tell us a little bit, first of all, about The Historian. Let's start with that. Tell us about the novel, The Historian.
Well, to be honest, I'm still not sure what kind of novel it is. I think it's a hard one to categorize. It's, as you say, part history, and the history in it is real and carefully researched up to the point of a partly fictional story. It's also very much a novel about travel. I love travel writing, and I've spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, and I wanted to express some of that experience of being a Westerner in Eastern Europe. So there are a lot of travelogues in it. And it's also partly supernatural, although I think of the Dracula in it as a symbol for history. It's also a romance. It has actually 3 love stories embedded in it. So I guess I could go on and on. I'm really not sure what shelf it belongs on.
Well, something I really loved about it is that your description there is very apt, that so many things, so many different types of writing going on. But also, when you read the book, a young lady discovers some lost papers, a lost book, that leads her to a tale of the demise of her, the horrible ruination of her father and different things going on with that, which in turn is another tale. So we're really following 3 different storylines throughout the book, and you've, through Cold War Europe, all types of stuff, and you've historically gone to these places and looked up the history. You've gone and traveled the world, so you're just not writing haphazardly. You've traveled the world for this story, basically, haven't you?
Well, a lot of the book is based on travels that I did before I wrote it. And I started going to Eastern Europe as a child with my father, who's a professor, and then went back to Eastern Europe after college on a study project, fellowship. And I arrived in Eastern Europe the autumn the Berlin Wall fell, so I saw the end of the Cold War there, and it was really fascinating experience. So a lot of that, you're right, is in the book. I tried to make the history in the book as absolutely carefully researched as possible. I know it's very important to me as a reader of novels, and sometimes historical novels, to feel that I'm learning something, and learning something that's in an accurate form when I read a novel.
Well, the producer of the show, Jerry, often says when he really loves a book, he says, well, I don't like that author because it kept me up all night. You would be accused of keeping many people up late nights, because when I was reading that book, it's quite a thick novel, and I remember, I've read it now about a year and a half ago, and I remember I got to go to bed at 11 o'clock. I'll stay up till 12. Next thing you know, it's 2:30 because you need to finish the next 30 pages. You've written such a wonderful account, and in previous interviews, I've read that you thank a couple of people. Your father is a very influential part of this book, and your husband's a very influential part of this book. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, my father is a professor, recently retired, and he also loves to read history and has a great sense of the history of Europe. And I dedicated the book to him partly because of that, and partly because he told me stories about Dracula when I was a child, which sounds a little a little strange. He's actually a very nice man. Um, but he's a great storyteller, and the stories he told us when we were children were stories that he got from those classic 1930s and 40s movies with Bela Lugosi, which I'm sure you've seen. And so they were basically the Bram Stoker version of Dracula, and we loved them. I think children often love Dracula. I mean, I think Dracula's almost the most popular Halloween costume, really. So he was a great inspiration for the book. Also, my husband is from Bulgaria. I met him there, and he was a wonderful consultant for this book. There are a lot of things you can learn in a library or even by interviewing people who've lived in certain situations. Sometimes I needed a detail or a fact or a part of life in Bulgaria that I just couldn't find in a library or even in an old movie. And sometimes I could ask him or members of his family and then of course I always double-checked all my information. But he was a great source of atmosphere for this book.
Well, Elizabeth, you must just be overwhelmed and overjoyed with the wonderful success of the book, and I'm so happy for you for the success. And now you've also, the movie rights have been acquired, and I understand that might be moving forward a little bit. Do you have any news with that you can share?
Well, the film is coming along very slowly, and I'm very happy about that, actually, because as you know, often if a Hollywood studio buys film rights for a novel, they rush the movie out while the novel is still on the shelves and just sort of to make sure the story is still hot in the press. And often the result is not so great because a movie that's made in very fast is often not a carefully made movie. And the studio that bought the book, Red Wagon Pictures, is meticulous. They made a beautiful movie out of Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden, and they actually worked for about 7 years on that movie with Arthur Golden. And they work closely with the writers of the novels they buy. So I'm very pleased about it.
Excellent. Now, Elizabeth, we have just a couple minutes left, and my friends who I've told I was going to interview you would throttle me if I didn't ask this question because they're all huge fans of your novel. And of course, everybody wants to know, well, when is she going to write a second novel, and what can we expect the second novel to be about?
Well, I'm deep into my second novel, and I think I'm probably close to half finished with it. And again, it's a long novel. I have to say it has nothing to do with Dracula. A little tiny bit of it is set in Eastern Europe, but mostly it has very different settings and very different subject matter. But I guess the similarity is that it is a long, complex story, and it involves a lot of historical research. But for the first time in this new novel, I'm writing about American places as well.
Excellent.
It's partly set in Europe, but I'm also writing about our era in the U.S., and I've found that very challenging. It's close at home, and it's not a topic I've tried before, but I'm really enjoying it.
Okay, well, Elizabeth, it's been an absolute delight to meet you and interview you. I wish you continued success, and we're definitely looking forward to The Historian to come out, both in the films and now the paperback's out, so folks at home can pick up the paperback. And I'm definitely looking forward to your next novel. And when that comes out, we'll track you down again, and we'll do a little interview for that. But I wish you continued success, and I want to thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We've been with Elizabeth Kostova, and she's been nice enough to tell us about her wonderful novel, The Historian. I can't recommend it enough. Read the book about a year and a half ago, and there are moments that are still burned into my mind that I enjoyed so much in that novel, and I really recommend you go and pick it up. But right now, I'd like you to stay tuned for more Cult Pop. Welcome back to Cult Pop. I'm with Michigan legend Loren D. Estleman, an absolute favorite of mine. Man's written over 50 novels. You folks are very familiar with his Amos Walker mysteries, all of his different Detroit historically set novels. Absolutely wonderful, wonderful author, and we're happy to have him here today. And I'm just going to get right to it. Loren, thanks for taking the time to be with us. What would you like to talk to us about? You've written over 50 books. You got a couple of new books in the pipeline, all kinds of stuff going on. Bring us up to date with you.
Oh gosh, it's hard to say. I always have to think. People will ask me whenever I go out to sign or to speak. First thing I do is I pull the book to read again to make sure I know which book I'm writing about, because there's always a delayed reaction going on here. I might be working like 2 books down the line when another book comes out in print. So I have to kind of refamiliarize myself. I'll be talking about the wrong book. But kind of excited right now. I've got a project just hitting stores now that Monty Nagler, photographer, and I have been talking about for about 7 years. It's called Amos Walker's Detroit, and Wayne State University Press is bringing it out. And what it is, it's a coffee table book, photographs. We culled descriptions of locations from around the Detroit area from the 27 years of the Amos Walker series. Places where he's discovered bodies, or where he's gotten in trouble, or some place he's passed through on the way to following out his investigation. And Monty was a world-class land and cityscape photographer, many awards behind his name, and a Michigan native himself. Went out and photographed these locations. So now the collectors can, when they've had enough of Amos Walker that I've published, they can take a look and see the stuff that I wrote before about the Motor City, right from the 1980s right on into the 21st century, and they'll be able to familiarize themselves visually with the locations thanks to Monty's wonderful photographs. And we said from the beginning, it has a new preface by me kind of discussing the series and the whole idea of the book. And I said it's not a Chamber of Commerce project. Right. You're not going to see, it's not the kind of thing you're going to see in a brochure.
So you're going to see some of the darker sides of different places.
And it's not that Amos trashes Detroit, but he has a very realistic view of it. And he also knows, as I know, that if Detroit didn't have the problems, some of the problems it has, he wouldn't have a job, and I wouldn't have much to write about. So.
Well, you said that 27 years. I was going to say 20-plus years you've been thrilling people with the Amos Walker series, spectacular books. Isn't there also a new Amos Walker novel coming out very soon besides that project?
Actually, what I've got is right now I'm working on Amos Walker number 20. That'll probably be out fall of next year. But I do have a book coming out in January, which is kind of a change of pace, but it's out of the old mode. The novel is called Gas City, and it is a very hard-edged novel about a Midwestern one-punch city that has one industry that keeps it going, which is the refinery in town. And the refinery is beginning to have some problems, beginning to have some financial problems, and so there's the possibility that there will be a labor layoff, things like that. So it has a lot of the problems of a lot of modern American industrial cities. But on top of it all, the longtime police chief's wife just died, and he's beginning to question his relationship with the gangster who's been corrupting him all these years. But the central question is, what happens when a corrupt civil servant begins to second-guess himself long after he's formed a close personal friendship with his corruptor? Sure. So who's going to be protecting whom in this situation? Who's going to be the threat? So I had some fun with that. It's many, many layers, and I drew from the histories and situations of a lot of American cities to create this scenario.
Well, that sounds like an absolute fantastic novel. And for folks at home who may not be familiar with Loren's work, I'd start with the one I told you, my all-time favorite, Whiskey River. Absolutely wonderful novel. It's a classic of yours now, probably 12, 14 years old maybe by this point. But absolute classic, Amos Walker's classic. Can you talk a little bit about Whiskey River just because I loved it so much?
Yeah, Whiskey River I'd wanted to do for a number of years because I've always been fascinated in the Prohibition years, 20s and 30s. I always thought if I could have a time machine, I would go back to the 1920s if I could take a lot of cash with me. Because any time in history is a great time to be rich and a lousy time to be poor, I've found in my research. But my parents were young in those years, and the stories that they told me, along with the great old gangster movies I grew up on, and books I read about the subject, have always fascinated me. I've always felt closer to that era than to my own. And a lot of family stories got told between the covers of that book. My mother used to date a member of the Purple Gang before she met my dad. And my dad used to, he lived on a farm right out here in the Ann Arbor area. And it was nothing back then to get into the Model T, family Model T, when their chores were done. and he and my uncle, his brother, would chug into Detroit. It's probably a 2 or 3 hour drive back then, mostly to hit the blind pigs, speakeasies, and they told stories about Jefferson Avenue being blocked off by a huge touring car and a guy in a beautiful suit with a submachine gun walking over to the car and saying, "Just be patient for a few more minutes, gentlemen. We're unloading a boat from Canada, a rum boat from Canada." And just very open like that. So those stories just fascinated me about a whole different kind of culture, which gave birth to the culture we live in today.
I love the fact that you've gone through the different eras, the Ed Soul, you have so many novels, but the Whiskey River always just spoke to me. I've read that book, read it, and went back and read it because I just love that novel so much.
Something about snap brim hats and submachine guns and in vintage automobiles that I think brings out the testosterone in all of us. I don't care whether we're male or female. It's something about the wildness. It was a post-war environment. We had won World War I. And when the soldiers got back, they found out that a federal law had been passed prohibiting the sale of alcohol. But nobody was really dumb. They had prohibited the sale of alcohol, but not the consumption of alcohol. Right. So it was illegal to sell it, but it wasn't illegal to buy it. So it became very popular, and we came out with more people drank. A larger percent of this country drank alcoholic beverages after Prohibition was repealed than before there was a prohibition. So it definitely changed the look of things.
Well, I certainly recommend that. And something I wanted to bring to the folks at home, a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that you've written some really fantastic Westerns. And now with the resurgence, now with 310 to Yuma coming out and a lot of a real nice resurgence going on. Why don't you talk, would you mind saying a few words about, we've got a couple minutes about your Western?
I've written many Westerns. Matter of fact, I once got into an elevator with a lady at the BoucherCon, the National Mystery Convention. And she said, "I wish you'd stop writing those Westerns. I want you to write mysteries all the time." And I said, "If I did that, you wouldn't like my mysteries." The reason being that the Westerns are a vacation from the mystery and vice versa. I can write a Western and write about something entirely different, make up my own town, and if I want to put the jail next to the general store, I can do it. I don't have to check. But I do a lot of research for that. I try to write about the West as it was, or as close as we can approximate it now, which is far more fascinating than the mythological West. The real story of what happened to the gunfight at the OK Corral is a lot more fascinating when you read the history than if you watch an old movie about it, which are fun. They're a lot of fun. They're very entertaining. But there's something about the grittiness of the reality that is even more fascinating. And that's the kind of West I like to write about. And I'm delighted to see this resurgence. It happens every few years. Yeah. They keep calling the Western dead. Yeah. But it will never die because it keeps coming back. And I think it's the only kind of storytelling you can say this about that keeps coming back. You know, someone, they die, you never see them again.
I agree. Well, we're going to have to wrap this up here, Loren, but I want everybody at home to know you've got to, and tell the folks at home, I can't believe that they haven't read your stuff, but if they say, hey, this guy sounds pretty interesting, you've got a one-stop website. They can look at the book, look at the cover, get a little synopsis. Tell the folks at home your website.
www.lorenestelman.com. And my wife, author Deborah Morgan, designed it and updates it and did a wonderful job with it. So it tells most of what you could ever possibly want to know about me, I think.
Okay. Loren, been an absolute pleasure. We're going to track you down in the future and interview you for 20, 30 more minutes because there's so much we could talk about. But we've been with Loren Estleman and just had a wonderful time here at the Carytown Book Festival. But we want you to stay tuned for more Cult Pop. Well, that wraps up another wonderful edition of Cult Pop. We had just a great time here at the Carytown Book Festival. If you'd like to meet wonderful authors like we had on the show today, Carytown is a festival that goes on every year here in Ann Arbor. Just Google it and you'll get all the information you want to know about it. But they've got a wonderful lineup planned for you in 2008, so I recommend you come. We'll see you next time on Cult Pop.